Welcome everyone to the last in the UK Library School of Information Science joint webinar series. We are very excited to be joined by Stephen Krueger, who is going to talk to us about open education resources. So at this point, Stephen, I will turn the floor over to you.
All right. This is a pretty small group, so I encourage people to ask questions. This is a small enough group that I think we can use the chat without getting overwhelmed. So to start, this is an extremely complicated topic that is people's entire jobs or several people's entire jobs. And so I'm going to do an intro emphasis on the Intro 101 level. Share my screen. All right, can everyone see the screen share? Excellent. So this is going to be an introduction to the concept of open educational resources, but it is also specifically tailored towards current information and library science students, and you'll see what that means momentarily. Quick for introduction, I'm Stephen Krueger. My pronouns are AM, think kind of like they, them without the TH. I am the Affordable Course Content Librarian at the University of Kentucky. So a large part of my job is specifically about this topic at UK. So to start off, this is the bit where it's tailored towards LIS students. We're sandwiching what is my usual OER 101 presentation for current faculty, teaching them about open educational resources that they might use or create. But I'm sandwiching that in things of why this is relevant to library students, because if these are all completely new terms, it may be a little bit tricky to connect it with how you're thinking of your current scholarship and your entry into the field. So what we've got here is 5 different quotes that I pulled up today by going to the ALA job list website and entering OER or open education in the keyword field. So I've pulled these mostly to demonstrate, don't worry about what the terms actually mean right now. We'll get to that. This is to show that it is helpful to you to know what they mean. So the first one up there is for an affordable course materials librarian, which is something similar to my position where someone's entire job is to know about this stuff and to provide support for their campus on this topic. Then the other ones these are possibly more relevant because they demonstrate that knowing about open education and OER specifically, and also open access and open publishing and all sorts of related topics, that's relevant to all sorts of different academic librarian jobs. So essentially, if you are interested in going into academic libraries, with some exceptions, but there's, I would say, a significant portion of the jobs, whether or not they're explicitly full-time about OER or open education in the way that mine is, a lot of the jobs, it will be extremely helpful to know about these topics because they will be these are all explicitly written into the job descriptions. They're preferred qualifications. They're listed in the job duties and responsibilities, and they're all about knowing about open educational resources and providing support about them. So the why you should care on this, we'll get to why you should care philosophically and why it's important generally speaking to academia and humanity as a whole. I've got a quote from the UN in the slides, I believe, but in terms of library students right now, you should care because knowing about this will help you get a job. And if you hear about this and find that you're actually very interested, there are full-time jobs about this, and you should contact me after and I will tell you all about those and work on you in getting some experience. But even if you're not thinking about this particularly, any kind of subject librarianship, a lot of other types of library work, it will be helpful to know about this stuff. All right. So now we're getting into the general OER 101. We're passing out of the meta section and into the presentation. So this is an example of this whole OER 101 section right up until we get to the first Q&A slide near the very end. This is going to be basically what I would give to faculty. This is a presentation that someone in my type of work would give to faculty or staff or anyone interested in this work at their institution. This is teaching people about the concept of open educational resources, which is something a lot of librarians do as part of our jobs. So I am no longer talking to LIS students. I am now talking to anyone interested in open educational resources, which is primarily going to be current faculty. So in this presentation, we will talk through the problem that we are trying to solve with open educational resources, which breaks down to very big picture, the right to education, which is a human right, the financial barriers to people meeting that right, and textbook costs as specifically one of those barriers. We'll talk about solutions to those textbook costs, and the solution that we'll be focusing on today is open educational resources, which is not the only solution, and we'll touch on that, but it is a big one, and it's, I would argue, the most sustainable one. We'll talk about what that actually means, so don't worry if none of these words have made sense so far. And we will talk about specifically how those work and how people create and can use them. We will talk about finding, like, literally how you can find open educational resources, how you'd use them, how you would publish them. We'll have some time for questions and discussion, and then we will transition out of the OER 101 for faculty and into the sandwich of the meta presentation about OER and library work, and that will make a lot more sense once we've done the 101. And as I'm going, please, I may or may not be able to keep an eye on the chat or raised hands while I'm going, but yes, Ashley, please let me know. Definitely with a group this small and informal, please interrupt me and we can address questions as they go. So like I said, this is a very big topic. We're not going to cover everything that I've got on the slides in depth. So if something that I'm talking about is particularly interesting to someone, or if someone needs clarification, I really want to know that so we can address that in a moment. All right, so big picture. Education is a human right, and high textbook costs are a barrier to that right. And when I say textbooks here, I essentially mean course materials, and that in itself is kind of an ongoing struggle of like, what do we even call this? Because textbook isn't really the correct term anymore, but it is a recognizable term. Course materials is like, what does that actually mean? It doesn't, all the things that are course materials aren't under OER necessarily. So when I say textbook costs, I basically mean course materials that you rent or pay for in the course of your education. This isn't just me saying this. This is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that education is a human right, that everyone has a right to it, and it should be free at the fundamental stages. And I have bolded a specific section of that statement, which is that higher education should be equally accessible to all. And the reason that that is bolded is because it currently is not. So zooming in a little on the statewide level, in 1980, about a fifth of the total revenue, the total education revenue at public institutions in Kentucky came from tuition. As of 2 years ago, it was over twice that. So when we talk a lot about like the rising cost of education, and we talk a lot about inflation, and I do want to be clear that it's not just vibes that education has gotten more expensive. It is actually, students are paying for much more than they used to proportionally, as well as like literally. So this is like a very significant problem, and it's a worse problem than it used to be. And on a very practical level, we're at an institution that openly makes its service to students whose families are at or below the poverty level a really central part of its identity. So this is, I'm coming from my last couple of jobs were at private institutions, which were much less public about these numbers. That's not to say the numbers were different, but they did not want to talk about them and make them a core of their identity. So especially at UK, we're also in a state with an extremely high poverty level compared to the rest of the country. So we have a food pantry. This is, and I will also say this is the UK specific version of a type of presentation that you can do at any institution, and like the template that the Open Education Network puts out for this, that I've modified for this, there's a slide that's basically like, go find an entry about your institution's food pantry and put stuff about that. This is not UK specific. We have a particularly compelling quote about the 40% of UK students experiencing food insecurity at some point during their college career, but this is also just every institution I've worked at has a food pantry and has students who need it. So when we talk about like the cost barrier to education and what that means to people, we're talking literally food. So the current cost of attendance at the University of Kentucky is supposedly around $35,000 a year for an in-state undergraduate student. Whether or not that maps to people's actual experiences can be debated, but we're going to focus in on one part of that. So we are going to talk about books and supplies. So you may note that apart from loan origination, which I only vaguely know what that means, this is the lowest number on that list. So I know this is a small group, but if anyone would like to, and non-students feel free to jump in and make the silence less awkward, but if anyone would like to put in the chat, or ideally just unmute and give some ideas, why are we talking about this specific number when it is looks like by far the least impactful number on this list? Ashley, I nominate you to break the awkward silence.
It's the number that we actually can control. We can do
Mhm.
something about this number.
That is one of the reasons. Any other thoughts on the other reasons? You or anybody else?
Don't be shy. You can type if you don't want to unmute.
That was my primary thought too, was that we do have more control over this. So I'm curious what other reasons are.
All right, so we have a lot to cover. So definitely keep putting things in the chat if you would like to, but I am going to move on. We'll get to we can control it a bit, which absolutely is one of the reasons, but it is also textbook costs are actually worse than anything else. So textbook costs have increased at over triple the rate of inflation over the past several decades. They've increased. I've seen, let's see, I've seen articles that show they have increased more quickly and higher than anything except, and like, I am not an economist, like when I say numbers like more quickly, and I do not actually know what those mean in context, but so they've increased at a higher rate than anything except healthcare and college tuition itself. Literally nothing else apart from those two things in the US has increased at a more drastic rate, much, much higher than the rate of standard inflation than textbooks, college textbooks specifically. So one of the reasons we're talking about this is like, it's actively worse than any of the other issues on there. We're also talking about it because the academic impact is really significant. So it's not just like we're doing something because this is the only thing we can do and we'd feel like we need to do something. This actually does make a difference. So there have been a number of studies over the last several, like at this point, 15 or so years. The Florida Virtual Campus has put out a study of like thousands of students in Florida every 2 years for over a decade now. And it's held pretty consistent with some of these numbers. The very, very similar, this graph shows like very, very similar responses have been gotten by a survey of about 5,000 students in the state of Virginia in 2020. And they put out the report the following year. And the impacts of these are students taking fewer courses. That's almost half of the students that they have surveyed in some cases saying that they take fewer courses due to textbook costs. It's around that saying that they don't register for a specific course knowing what the textbook would cost them. So lower numbers, but still a quarter of respondents saying they have dropped a course, a little bit less than that say they have withdrawn from a course. The earn a poor grade one and fail a course due to the lack of a textbook or course materials, those are a little bit fuzzier because these are all self-reported. So a student saying, I earned a poor grade because of this, that's a very fuzzy response, but the important thing is that those are self-reported. That's how people understand their relationship with the materials. And it's absolutely true in a lot of cases. I do want to acknowledge, though, that like it's a less quantifiable action than I withdrew from this course because of this thing. It's also sort of subjective. What does a poor grade mean to a given student? And the one that we all know is happening, but it's useful to see the numbers, is well over half of the students in any survey on this just say that at some point they just don't purchase the textbooks. And that's not they don't purchase any textbooks, but that's at some point, possibly frequently, they just opt out. And then the other reason that we are talking about this specifically is the cost of textbooks causes disparate harm to already marginalized students. This is, again, multiple surveys have shown this, that when we look at those numbers about the harm that is done, those go up often very significantly when you filter for things like race that is not white, when you filter for socioeconomic status, when you filter for students who are caring for family members who are working full-time in addition to going to school. I did a similar survey at my last institution, and it was about 200 students that took it. And let's see, going back to that last slide about not purchasing the textbooks or like all of these numbers. When I filtered for first generation students, those numbers almost doubled. So when we're talking about the academic impact, it is really, really important to know that that impact is not the same on all students, and students who already have an easier time literally accessing education in every possible metric are also much more harmed by this specifically. All right. And then we get into the much more actionable elements of, we're talking about this because we can do something about it. Like when you go back to that list of the costs of education, we can't do anything, like very, very few of us are in a position to do anything about tuition at any institution or food costs or housing costs, but like this is a number that is not an insignificant number. This is a national average of students being told to spend $1,200 a year on textbooks every year. And I'll get back into what that number means maybe if we have time at the Q&A. It's a more complicated number than it sounds, but it's a decent number. It's hundreds of dollars a year. But like we literally can just fix this, and we don't need permission or and again, for the LIS students, pretend I am talking to faculty. Like if you were giving this talk, you would be giving it to faculty primarily. But like we can resolve this issue without institutional policies. You can just do it in your class. Practically speaking, that's because there are a bunch of fairly easy solutions. There's a lot of alternatives to students having to buy commercial textbooks, and again, remember when I say textbooks, we're thinking like course materials. So that also goes for like homework platforms that you would pay for. It goes for digital textbooks that you would rent. There's a lot of alternatives to having paid materials for that. Faculty, literally, you choose what to assign for your course, with some exceptions that can be a bit complicated, but like academic freedom is a huge part of being teaching faculty, and like you get to choose what you're assigning your courses. And by extension, you're choosing what you're asking students to pay for that. And therefore, it is your responsibility to know what you're asking students to pay and what that means for them. And there's also a whole bunch of support on pretty much every campus. Well, not every, but at most big institutions, you'll have at least someone doing at least part-time, often full-time, sometimes multiple people doing a job like mine, where our job is to help you with this problem. So any questions or thoughts on the what is the problem element before we move on into the practical solutions? All right. So the solution there's, like I said, there's a bunch of different options for this. Open educational resources are what we're going to talk about today. There's also materials that are free but not open. We'll get into what that distinction actually means in a little bit. There's library collections, which are very, very much not free. This is also useful for library students to think about. I know I was boggled when I got into the field and learned the amount of money that libraries spend on our collections, especially our digital collections. Like, it is an astronomical amount of money. It solves this problem because it is free to students, but we're not focusing on that partly because like OER is a separate thing, but also because there's a level of unsustainability in the way publishing works and the prices publishing charges. And once you get into the field, you'll have a lot more thoughts on that, I promise. But it's important to how to put this. So my job here is not OER librarian or open education librarian. My job is affordable course content librarian. So OER is the biggest tool I use for that, but it is not the only tool I use. So all of these things on the screen, I use when I have a meeting with a faculty member who wants to, like say one of the SIS faculty members came to me and wanted to talk about like alternatives to reduce or remove their textbook costs in a given course. We would look at all of these things. I would bring Stacy into the conversation because she is the subject liaison for that program and thus knows a lot more about a bunch of the stuff on here than I do. So when we're actually looking at solving the problem of textbook costs, there's a bunch of different tools. So we're going to focus in on open educational resources, but they are not a standalone thing, and they need to be done in combination with all sorts of other things. My goal generally is like, what is the problem and how do we solve it? Not how do I convince someone to use an open textbook? And as we noted in the surveys, students are already solving this problem, in many ways not terribly legally. Like when you say you choose not to buy a textbook, you're not necessarily saying, I am not accessing the textbook. You're not doing it in a way where you paid for it or accessed it through ways that are inherently legal in the state of, in the conditions of US copyright law. But like pirating textbooks is like everyone does it. We all know everyone does it. Faculty know everyone does it. And one of the main arguments against that on my end is there's the legality of it, but there's also like, it's just unreliable. Like if students are consistently needing to pirate their textbooks online because they can't afford it, what happens when the most reliable copy that has not been legally posted goes away? Like those students just don't have access to it anymore, regardless of whether they accessed it legally or not. I will also note that it is not illegal to access a thing that has been posted. It is illegal to do the posting, but that's why it's unreliable. That could go away at any point, like a YouTube video that's been taken down for copyright infringement. So the reason we're focusing on open educational resources is that they're I think the most sustainable of the options. But again, like especially for students who are going into library work, you also need to be doing this in collaboration with the subject liaisons, with collection development, with course reserves, with all sorts of things. So 25 minutes in, I'm going to define OER. So when I say open, that means two things. That means the material is free, and it also means that it has permissions that work a specific way. So free, there's no cost barrier to anyone. Usually it's online. It's literally just, no one has to pay to access this material. I would also argue that there is no login requirement because giving your personal data is a form of payment, especially and increasingly so in our current technological and societal environment. So I don't think it counts. Monetary freeness is not the only definition of that, especially if you have to enter like more information than just creating a login. But like even that, like I think fully free means like you can just click on it and there's no login, it's collecting no data whatsoever. It is actually free. That said, all of this gets very fuzzy, and like you'll see some things presented as open where you do have to create an account even if it's a free account. Not ideal, but in many cases, we're working on solving the problem, and sometimes that means accepting the less ideal solutions. The permissions part is where it gets complicated, and this is what I am assuming is new information to a lot of people. So let's see. This is where I strongly encourage you to ask me clarifying questions as needed, because copyright is one of those things where you forget what you assume as baseline knowledge. And usually you're wrong about that. So let's see. By US copyright law, when you create a thing that qualifies, so anything that has the degree of originality that qualifies for copyright, you automatically own that. You don't need to register copyright, you just automatically own the copyright to that work. There's all sorts of caveats around work for hire and such, but like without thinking about those, the copyright is automatically owned by the person who created the work. When we talk about permissions and Creative Commons, we are talking about ways in which the owner of the copyright of material, like we're recording this presentation, it is in a fixed tangible form, or it will be. That means I, as the presenter, I own the copyright to this talk. That means I can decide what rights I want to assign to that, and I can decide whether to sign it over to a publisher. I am not going to do the copyright lecture right now. We can get into that more at the end if people want to, but that is a separate, again, a thing that you do really need to know getting into library work, but it's a much bigger, complicated topic. But when I say open access is free plus permissions, something can be like I can do a blog post that is free online, but unless I have put an open access license on it, it is not open in the sense of the flexibility of OER that we'll get into in a little bit. It's free, but I still own the copyright and people cannot infringe on that copyright without breaking the law. So when we say, I'm realizing as I'm talking about this bit that especially for students who haven't gotten into author rights or like thought about academic writing or publishing, this may make even less sense than it does typically. So definitely please ask me questions if this is getting too confusing about the copyright bit. I am going to skip past most of the copyright heavy stuff because it's so complex. But if things really truly just don't make sense, please stop me. So short version, open access means free with specific permissions assigned by the creator that work within the context of copyright law. The types of materials, literally the format of things that can be OERs, literally anything that is used for education and is those free plus open access permissions. It can be, we talk a lot about open textbooks, but it can also be, it can be a recording like this. It could be, you can put a Creative Commons license on a slide deck, and that's OER. You can do it on podcasts, videos, test banks, homework assignments, data sets. Literally anything that is free, openly licensed, and used for education is an open educational resource. This is where it gets complicated and of wildly varying degrees of relevance to different people. So this is something, again, getting into the meta version of this presentation, since I'm talking to library students and not current faculty who are thinking about like publishing their own textbooks, I am going to tell you that learn this as needed. Don't worry too much about, like, don't worry about learning the specifics of copyright law. Don't worry, like, I'm going to skim very quickly through the Creative Commons sections of this because one, it's the type of complexity that you just won't retain until you're actually doing it. Two, it is, all of this information is extremely readily available. You do not need to worry about memorizing it. Like, once you get into the field, like, the main skill set that you'll need is know where to find the information, not memorizing the information like you would for a test. So pretty much everything I'm saying, remember that this information exists, you can find it, and possibly most importantly, if you are not the person in my type of role on your campus, there's probably someone who is, or there's at least someone in your networks, or there's someone you can ask about this. So the main takeaway for the library students on this whole section is know that all of this is important, but you may not need to be the person who knows it. So if it's too confusing right now, do not worry about that. That is very normal. And also it is not a bad thing if you don't retain all of this. So back into the 101 bit. So typically commercial textbook publishing works by a publisher produces a textbook, they pay an author a portion of what the money that students and others who buy the textbook give them. Often a very, very small portion. So one of the arguments for this is most academic publishing, the author does not actually get paid or gets paid so little that it doesn't make it, it's not a strong argument for not making things open access. I'm gonna move the Zoom window a little bit so that I can actually see this slide. So the way that open access publishing works shifts it a little bit so that the funding does not come from, so to be very clear, it is not free to create materials. Publishing is not free. Good publishing really is not free. So that means even if you're publishing something fully online, there's costs like hosting, there's costs if you want like a textbook, there's costs like editing, graphic design, indexing, like all of these things, someone has to do that labor. And what we are not arguing for is for that labor to be unpaid. In a lot of cases, it ends up being that is a problem that we are working on solving in a bunch of different ways. But the answer to this is not the author doesn't get paid at all. And the answer is not that all of that work about like producing the materials themselves is done for free. answer is where that money comes from when it is not coming from people paying for the materials. I also want to be clear that the money that people are paying for to the publisher, the vast majority of that is just publisher profit. Academic publishers and scholarly publishers and textbook publishers make an enormous profit. So that's why that very small amount of money that goes to the author is so small. Like, I'm not going to get into the details at this point too much because that's a deep rabbit hole. But one of the reasons that the open access model works is that a lot of the money that is being paid just isn't actually going towards the production of the work. It's going to the publisher, which is a for-profit company. So the alternative to doing that is that the money that is actually needed to produce the materials is, so one example is like a grant that we have at the UK that I manage that we'll talk about a little bit more later, which is a pretty common model of producing open educational resources, which is the institution or some combination of the institution, donors toward that specific cause, which is one thing we have here, grants from the government, from various foundations, all sorts of different ways, but the funding comes from within or without the institution, usually through the institution. It goes to the author, and so for the grant program, we give our authors, frankly, a fairly small amount of money, maybe a couple of $1,000s for a given project, and which is not necessarily less than they would be getting paid by a commercial publisher, depending on the work and the publisher and the contract. So we do compensate them, and because that money is coming from externally or from within the institution itself, there's no cost to the materials. So it is published, it's usually published online, and it's just made available for free. Now we're getting into the free plus permissions element of that. So the change in this slide is just that little C, which is the stand-in for copyright and also Creative Commons. So in commercial publishing, the author transfers full ownership of the copyright to the publisher, most conventionally. Again, exceptions, it's complicated. Contracts are a whole area that I actually find super fascinating, but I'm not going to get into right now. But for the most part, authors transfer full ownership of their intellectual property of this, say, a textbook, to a publisher. That's what you're paying the publisher for. When we make open access materials, the author retains copyright and the author assigns a license to that work that lets them still own their own intellectual property of it. And the license allows people to access and use and adapt that work for free, specifically because the author has put that license on it, which is not a thing that you see too much in commercial publishing. I'm wildly oversimplifying this. I'm a little bit more self-conscious because I know there are librarians in this in the audience, and who I am aware that I am oversimplifying this, let's say. But essentially, that's how those two free plus permissions elements work to create something that is truly open access and available. I am going to skim directly through this because Creative Commons is fascinating and super important, and is not a thing I can cover in the amount of time we have available for this. But know that this is something you should, honestly, I really think all library students need to know about this. So bring me back for a separate webinar and we'll talk about Creative Commons. But Creative Commons is a very, very short version. It is a framework within US copyright law that enables authors to retain their copyright and also give people permissions of how to use it. The general permissions that you can give people are, you can use this work. So say I put a license on this presentation, I would be saying you could use this work. Let's see, you can do whatever you want with it, share it freely, as long as you cite me as the author. That's in all Creative Commons licenses. I can say you can do whatever you want with this as long as you don't use this for profit. That's that non-commercial with the little $ with the no through it. I can say, I can give people permission to use my work in all sorts of ways, but not make money off it, which prevents commercial publishers from absorbing it and making a profit on it. Creative Commons licenses can be done in all sorts of ways, and again, separate topic. All right, so that's essentially how OER work. That's the most complicated and in-depth that's going to get. So we are going to go into how you would find, use, and create open educational resources. And again, this is the lecture that I would give to faculty. who would be the ones thinking about creating their materials or making their existing work open access. There's a couple of places where you can find open textbooks and other OER. So there's a website called the Open Textbook Library, which is essentially a repository. It's not a repository in itself. It's a search tool that collects links to existing open textbooks. There's also a site where you can find all sorts of different things that are not necessarily textbooks, like that whole slide I had with all of the different things that count as OER. And again, because you all are probably not going to be looking and doing this right now, I'm not going to go into the details of finding OER. And let's see. What I am going to talk more about is the ways in which one might use open educational resources, again, as a faculty member. So, or faculty or other people who are teaching courses, which increasingly in the US is not faculty. And so there's two ways that you can use existing OER. So that means, so say you go into the Open Textbook Library, you find a book that someone else has published and put a license on. You can either adopt it wholesale, so say it fits your needs or it fits them closely enough to match the amount of time you have to work on the project. You can just start using that. You can send, again, this is all free. It's available to anyone online. So you can send it out to, you send your students the link. You tell them what chapters to read like you would with any commercial textbook, and they do, except they don't have to pay for it. That is by far the easiest approach. The reason that's not the only approach is that open textbooks have existed for, let's see, maybe less than 15 years at this point, in the way that we are talking about them. So that is a comparatively small amount of time against, let's see, against the history of commercial publishing. So that just means we just have fewer materials available at this point. There just has not been time to produce all of the materials that would replace, fill in all of the gaps for all of education. So especially when I talk to like people doing graduate level courses or higher level undergrad courses or more niche subjects, the answer may or may not be that something already exists. So I may not be able to just send them something they can adopt. Or there might be one thing that they don't particularly like for whatever reason, or there might be something that's slightly outdated or whatever. Like there may or may not be something that someone can just adopt and plug into their course. But in many cases, increasingly there is. So there's an increasing number of open textbooks available. The other thing you can do, because of those licenses, what Creative Commons licenses actually allow you to do is to make adaptations to existing works. So that means that you can, so say you find an open textbook that you kind of sort of like, or that needs a little bit of updating, or that mostly works, but you want to fill in a gap, you can make revisions to it. You can then share and you make those revisions attributing the original author. None of this involves claiming ownership of work that someone else did. You share your new version, noting the revisions that you made, and you claim ownership of that work. And you share that out, and it makes it much more flexible and adaptable to your students. And the posting it for others to use is important because part of this whole system is that it's about feeding back into the amount of material that's available. It's about like the work that you're doing isn't just for your own students, it's also for someone else who might find that work valuable as well, in the way that you found the work valuable that someone else did. What you do when you can't find something so say a professor comes to me and they want to use an open educational resource or just use a free resource for their class, and there really just is nothing. This happens sometimes, like this happened recently for a business Spanish course that I talked to the professor for, and there was not a textbook on this that was open access. There were very few textbooks that were commercially available because it's such a specific topic. So the solution there is you make a new resource. And going back to the compensation element, we are not asking people to do this for free. In some cases, that ends up being the only answer if they really want to do it. We're working on solving that in many ways. That's what the grant program here does, but and again, similar to commercial publishing, they may or may not get compensated appropriately for that work anyway, which is not, that's not me saying it's thus okay to ask people to do it for free, but academic publishing is a very complicated, often very predatory system. And so this is trying to find solutions to that as well as creating new materials. So when you're creating say you want to write a new textbook, or when you want to create a podcast and make it open access, or make a new slide deck, or put an open access license on your syllabus, all of those count as OER. So you create the material, you pick a Creative Commons license, thinking about how you want people to use your work. Let's see, and then you put it out there. And putting it out there is a very, very shorthand term for something I'll talk about a little bit later about the kind of work I actually do, but there are ways to do that. Quick version that is very much, this is again, this is for faculty. This is not really for current library students, but the support that exists at UK. And again, think about this in terms of, this is all work that librarians can do. So this is stuff that you will need to think about as you would be the support on this slide. Sometimes there's an actual person doing it. Sometimes it is sometimes it's part of the work that subject liaisons do. There's institutional repositories and other platforms where you literally post the work, and that's getting into how you publish. There's, I talked about, the grant program where we provide some funding and other support to people who want to adopt or create open educational resources at UK. I also, like all librarians, I have a LibGuide, which is where I point people who are interested in learning more about this topic, that goes into more depth, provides a lot more resources about OER. This is not the real questions and discussion version. This is where I would stop and go into questions for the faculty version. We are going into the secret section, which is, we're back into the meta version of this talk. So all of what I just talked about is that's what I would do for an OER 101 for UK faculty. I might do it for a particular department and hone in more specifically on okay, and that bit where I looked at the Open Education Library, I'd actually open that up. We'd search for, say, physics textbooks if it's the physics department, and we'd look at what OER exist in their field. I might do it as a completely open session that anyone can sign up for, and we talk more generally. But what this work actually why this is relevant to libraries is that sorry. This is work that shows up more and more increasingly in academic library work. Not exclusively academic libraries, but the vast majority of it. It might be a full-time job like mine, like the first one I showed on that very initial slide, or it might be a portion of all sorts of different jobs. It's related to scholarly communications, subject liaison work, research and instruction, student success, looking at those impacts from the surveys. If you're a student success librarian or a student engagement librarian, this is one of the big things that often will impact that. And again, it's one of the things that we can do something about. It is relevant to collection development. And I'll talk a little bit more about that if people are interested. And this work also takes place outside of libraries. So there's a bunch of nonprofit organizations around open education and open educational resources. There's publishers, literally the most established open textbook publisher is called OpenStax. It's out of Rice University. And it is that's not run out of the library, it's run out of the university, but it's one of the types of organizations that is related to this work. There's also, sometimes this is done outside the library completely. There will be a job in the teaching and learning office or somewhere else on campus that is basically doing exactly the same work, but just doesn't happen to live in the library. So what that work actually is, it can be any combination of these things. It can be doing workshops like this one or more detailed ones. It's a lot more of individual consultations, working with faculty on solving a problem that that's where the meat of my work really is. It's doing consultations with faculty on, okay, you want to find or create an open educational resource for this particular course. How do we find that? Or what does it mean to create it? And that can get into a lot of detail that I won't get into today. Let's see. It can also mean assessing the impact of textbook costs. So those surveys we looked at, I'm aiming to do one for UK, to survey UK students on their experiences with textbook costs, because that will give me the data to look at what does this actually mean here? Like what are students spending, or what harm is being done by textbook costs at UK? Because that will let me talk much more specifically about like to campaign for support for this work, to campaign for increasing that grant, because we need the local data. And it's really common for a job like this to be managing like that grant program. So that's like right now I'm organizing the selection committee to look at the round of proposals that just came through, and we will decide how to allot funding for people who are interested in creating or adopting OER at UK. The last thing to remember is you're not doing this work alone, or if you are, it's a little bit doomed to failure, but mostly you're not. And mostly that means you're working very, very collaboratively with other subject liaisons in all sorts of different ways. You're working with other campus offices that are invested in this like everyone is invested in this for different reasons. There's an argument for OER as an accessibility, a solution to the accessibility of textbooks if they're done properly, which takes its own kind of work. You're also working incredibly closely with a lot of faculty or whole departments who have decided that they want to take this on. And again, a lot of this work happens off campus. So you're connecting with colleagues at related institutions who are doing similar work. There's a lot of conferences and listservs and published materials about this. There's a couple of journals in the field that are specifically about OER. So you are not doing this work on your own, whether this is your full-time job or not. All right, actual Q&A section. Feel free to put questions in the chat or to unmute.
I have a question.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Young.
Do you notice you already briefly mentioned about this, some of the open textbook is lacking in certain area. Did you see some of the discipline has a kind of more popular adopting open education resource, or others not so much?
Yeah, for sure. There's sort of two angles on that. One of them is that the disciplines that are strong in open education, and literally the number of resources that exist, are also the ones that are strong in open access initially. So, and again, I'm trying not to go too into the whole scholarly publishing landscape, but like if you're familiar with Archive, which is it's a subject repository for physics, computer science, math, and it's been an established way of publishing scholarly articles, open access preprints in that repository for years and years and years. Like it's a really core element of the physics field at this point. You find that fields who already know about open access publishing and are already used to making their work freely available and having that sort of conversational, working with others, collaborating in publishing and building off each other's work, those are the ones where it's strong in OER. Humanities tend to have much fewer materials available. I think that's for a bunch of reasons. And that is slowly changing, but I would say STEM tends to be much stronger in OER. One reason for that is also that it's not necessarily subjects, but like subjects and fields, but when OpenStax, that publisher out of Rice University, when they started 12 years ago now, their goal was to create an open textbook for like the 101 levels of the 25 most commonly taught college courses in the US. And like they have focused on numerical impact, like solving these issues for like numbers of students rather than trying to do a widespread like to cover all subjects regardless of how many people might take them. So the ones where they're most common, where you're most likely to be able to find an existing resource are things like intro level chemistry, intro level most anything at this point. Again, heavier in the STEM, less in the humanities, but those high number impact courses are the ones where someone has most likely been supported in creating a book or creating other materials as well. So it's both some fields, yes, it's stronger in, but also it's just about like the more commonly taught and the more students are impacted, the more likely the things are.
Yeah. Follow-up question. When the faculty publish the open educational material, is there any kind of peer review process? So when the faculty publish their book through the publisher, they always go through some peer evaluation process. So I'm asking about how the quality assurance is embedded in the open education resource publication process.
Mhm. So, side note for students who, if you end up doing presentations like this is exactly the kind of question you will get. So this is excellent demonstration. So that depends completely on what that publishing process looks like. So how open access publishing works, how open educational resource publishing works, which is separate from open access in terms of like open access journals and such. But when we're talking about like producing open textbooks, or especially with the other non-textbook objects, it varies wildly. So it depends on basically if you're publishing through a system that has peer review built in, which mostly, again, like that's labor, that's time. We don't want to have people do that uncompensated. So you may or may not have that available through like a grant program. You may, like some people choose to have their own peer review, and that they'll put something out there and ask people, experts they trust in their field, to review it and give them feedback. What there is in a system like the Open Education Network, the Open Textbook Library, which is run by the Open Education Network, or in OER Commons as well, if you go into those and look at a resource, there's the option to review it. And that's something that Open Textbook Library specifically really puts emphasis on, that it really strongly encourages other faculty in the field that the book is on to do a public review. They have a review form. Sometimes you can get a stipend for doing that, but to give like honest feedback on, and public feedback on how they found that book. So when you look at the Open Textbook Library, you can see like there's the 5-star rating system on the average, and you can see how people have rated that book and also how many people have scored it. You can read the reviews. So it depends. It's not as systematized because, again, there's a benefit in being a highly profitable publishing system in that like you do have the systems available to make some things more consistent than others, but there's a lot of different solutions that people have found, and with OER publishing, the flexibility is sort of the point. The flexibility and transparency.
Okay, thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you ended up in your current role. So what was your career trajectory? I think our students are always interested in knowing kind of where people start and then how they end up getting into new or deeper parts of the field.
One of the reasons something I think current library students should know is OER librarianship and like similar positions that all titled variously different things. It is one of the areas of academic library work that is at least somewhat growing, as opposed to having positions just cut and cut and cut forever. It's not growing as much as, say, health sciences librarianship or maybe data librarianship, but there's an increasing number of positions in OER, and there's not that many people with experience in them. So if it's something you are interested in, it is one of the easier realms of academic librarianship to get into, because you need a relatively small amount of background to have more experience than most people do going into it. So the way I think I did a pretty normal way of falling into this full time, which is doing it out of interest. At my first librarian job, I was running the access services department at a very small school, which was flexible enough that like we didn't have anyone doing this, even part-time. So like I went to some workshops that were funded by a professional organization and like started doing this work on my campus by talking to my dean about what we like, that there was room for it, and making that part of my job. It was a relatively small part then, but that gave me the experience to go into my next job where it was a much bigger part. And from there, so that was like a scholarly communications librarian type role where OER is usually a really strong part of that, but it's certainly not all you're doing. You might be managing the institutional repository, you might be doing a whole bunch of other things. And because OER and textbook affordability continued to be the most exciting part of that job for me, I wanted to go into doing it full time, which is how I stepped into this. So it's sort of, I think I heard it mentioned in one class very, very part-time in library school and then just sort of eased into it. But that's a really normal way of getting into any kind of specialized library work, is you start doing it because you're interested in it, and then you can build that into eventually going full-time into it if that is appealing to you.
Thank you. Do any of our students have any questions?
Well, can I just say, as the librarian for the College of Communication and Information, I know it would have been so beneficial for me when I was a library school student to hear what it's like to be a librarian and giving a presentation to faculty, like what a real world experience would be like. So thank you very much, Stephen, for doing that. I think that is super helpful to see, you know, what it's actually like to go out and present to a faculty group and what types of questions you might get from a faculty group.
I will also say that like this type of presentation, not necessarily about OER specifically, but like the talk that you saw Isaac give, that like all of these, we do these all the time. This is a super normal part of like a lot of different academic library jobs, anything where you're working directly with faculty, especially if you're like the expert on a thing across the campus, or if you're a subject liaison, you might be working more directly on a particular, like you might be doing like presenting on a particular type of library resource for your faculty or for students. But like this kind of presentation, regardless of the subject, is a really central part of a lot of academic library jobs. So if you have access to learning about or getting comfortable with public speaking or making slides, like those are all incredibly useful skill sets. You also will have to do it for every job interview you ever do. My sympathies.
Are there any final questions before we wrap up?
I think Bobby might be working on something.
Yes.
Yeah, like I said, it is a growing part of all sorts of different work. So definitely, like when you're thinking about job talks and such, if you see this mentioned in like as a preferred qualification, even if it's not a thing you know a whole lot about, like do some research and pull it in there, and that will, because it's such a growing important part of academic libraries and academia generally, like it will carry weight to know about that stuff.
All right, thank you all so much for joining us. We will hopefully have this up on the SIS YouTube channel next week for anyone who was not able to join us tonight. And this does conclude our webinar series for spring 2024. So please be on the lookout in future semesters for announcements if the series is coming back. So thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great evening.